Hello to my intro psych students, section 04. Some tech problems yesterday, so I'm going to put this up on my YouTube channel, and I'll be sending you all an email to give you the specifics. So I'm going to do kind of a mini lecture today. First of all, welcome to my home. As you can see, that's my bedroom in the background. Not really. It's my kitchen. You'll probably see cats walking by on occasion. If you were here, I would make you a pot of tea from somewhere up there, but you're not. But I am. Okay, here we go. So there's two things I want to talk about today. The first is from Module 1, Review Sheet 1, I want to finish talking about a couple of ideas on that review sheet. So if you look at your notes from last class, and if you've read Module 1 in the textbook, 1, 2, and 3 on the review sheet, we covered 1 in class, 2 and 3, which has to do with the different subfields in psychology and the 4 goals of psychology. 2 and 3 on the review sheet are on your plate. You need to read the book and learn them. But number 4, I wanted to talk about a little bit. So if you read number 4, it basically points out that in modern day psychology, there's a lot of controversy about the best ways to explain human behavior, or actually the behavior of any animals. And in other words, there are different viewpoints in modern day psychology. Some psychologists believe that pretty much everything that's going on in an animal's behavior or a human's behavior is biological. Other psychologists focus on the role of culture. Other psychologists focus on the process of learning as the most important thing in making us who we are. Now, if you look at the review sheet, there are 6 different points of view. I'm going to cover 3 of them. And then the other 3, I'm going to turn over to you from Module 1 in the textbook. So let's imagine it this way. Imagine that you have 6 pairs of glasses sitting on the desk in front of you. You're going to put those glasses on 1 pair at a time. Each of those glasses represents a different viewpoint. So when you put on the biological glasses, the way you understand behavior and mental processes is biologically. You understand it through genetics, brain chemistry, and so on. But if you take those glasses off and put on your cross-cultural, also called your sociocultural glasses, when you look at the world that way, you're not focusing on how we're shaped by biology. You're focusing on how we're shaped by culture, by society. So to put it simply, if you had been born and raised in a different part of the world, a different culture, if you lived in a different culture than the culture or society you live in now, you would be a different person. You'd think differently. You'd handle your emotions differently. You would act differently. You would dress differently, and so on. So I'm going to go through 3 approaches. The first 3, and those are the biological approach, the psychodynamic, also called the psychoanalytic approach, and the sociocultural, also known as the cross-cultural approach. Let me start with the biological approach. The biological approach is very powerful in modern-day psychology in the United States. Maybe too powerful sometimes. Maybe we over-explain human behavior and human mental processes based on biology. Nevertheless, the biological approach really argues that the bottom line, the most important reason that makes us act and think the way that we do, is what's going on biologically, our physical, organic self. All right? So we all have bodies. And bodies all have brains and nervous systems that operate a certain way. Our bodies are always producing brain chemicals and hormones. Our bodies are the end result of thousands of generations of our ancestors' genetic evolution. That's what the biological approach is about. So let me give you a couple of examples. One would be, under the biological approach, a subheading would be genetics. And unless you have an identical twin, unless you're a M-O-N-O, monozygotic twin, there's nobody else on the planet Earth that has the same DNA that you do. Now, your closest DNA relatives would be your biological siblings. So brothers or sisters who had the same biological mom and dad. But you and your biological sibs only share about 50% of your DNA in common with each other. There's another 50% that makes you uniquely you. And this might be one of the reasons why children turn out differently in the same family. Even though they're raised in the same environment growing up, the same family, the same parents, and so on, they're not the same genetically. So one child might be born genetically more programmed to be shy, to kind of withdraw when they experience new things. Another child might have a different genetic program and be less likely to act that way, and so on. But to take that a step further, on a different topic, without a doubt, there are some psychological disorders that are partly tied to genetic inheritance. And again, this is the biological approach. The bipolar disorder and schizophrenia, without a doubt, are partly tied to genetics. Both of those disorders run in families genetically. Now, do you notice I keep saying the word partly tied? And that's an important term. There's more to it than that. Even though there's a genetic push, or what's called genetic loading, for disorders like schizophrenia and the bipolar disorder, it will often take certain sorts of life events in childhood, in adolescence, perhaps young adulthood, to pull the trigger and set it off. So a way to think of it is genetics sometimes might load the gun for a particular disorder, but it takes environmental factors to pull the trigger. And that's one of those old nature plus nurture interactions. In more modern day English, it's called genetics plus environment. Rarely is it all genetics or all environment. A lot of things in life, it's a mix of the two. And those two disorders are examples. There's some evidence that some types of depression might be tied to genetic vulnerability. Now, depression is actually a spectrum disorder. A little bit like, autism is sometimes called a spectrum disorder. There are different types of depression. And some types of depression really do seem to have a genetic push to them, while other types of depression seem to have a lot more to do with what's going on in somebody's life, the stressors that they're experiencing, or perhaps they've experienced a tremendous trauma or a tremendous loss in the recent past. But there's a type of depression called major depression, which is a more severe form of depression, and that does seem to at least be partially tied to genetics. The Hemingway family, Ernest Hemingway, the author, the Hemingway family can trace multiple generations of severe depressions, which seem to be tied to a genetic vulnerability in that family to get depressed. And then there's some other ones as well. The ease to which somebody has a panic attack does seem to maybe be partly genetic. And without a doubt, some forms of substance abuse, and certainly alcoholism, there is a genetic vulnerability. So, for example, if both of a person's biological parents and or grandparents had a major problem with the drug called alcohol, there is evidence that that child is born genetically more at risk. You know what genetics always reminds me of? That life ain't fair. Some people are born more genetically gifted in terms of intelligence than others. Other people might be born genetically more likely to behave in extroverted or introverted ways, or more at risk for a disorder. It is what it is. Now, let me add one more piece to the puzzle of the biological approach. And we're going to get to this next week as we begin to look at how the brain works. We'll delve into this more deeply. Right now, your brain is making dozens of different chemicals. And these brain chemicals, which come in all different shapes and sizes, are called neurotransmitters. As long as your brain is living and functioning, it's making dozens of different neurotransmitters. And these brain chemicals, these neurotransmitters, have to be in the right balance for us to act and think and handle our emotions in proper ways. And I bet you've all heard of some of them. You've probably all heard of serotonin, which is one particular neurotransmitter, Serotonin. Actually, serotonin is not only made in your nervous system, it's made in your gut. Your stomach and intestines, especially your intestines, actually make more serotonin than your brain does. So serotonin is one of these brain chemicals and body chemicals that's involved in many different things. It regulates your mood. It regulates your ability to digest food properly. But there is some evidence that brains that don't make enough serotonin might be brains that might be more vulnerable to developing certain sorts of mood disorders, like certain types of depression. Serotonin also regulates your hunger drive. So when you eat a meal, when you fill your belly full of food, a signal gets sent to your brain cells, the hunger center in your brain that basically raises your serotonin and at least for a period of time suppresses your hunger drive. Now, there are others you've probably heard of. Dopamine, which regulates our pleasure circuits. Anything that makes your body happy, whatever it is, involves a spike of dopamine. Dopamine spikes are also part of the story of drug addictions like cocaine addictions. When you do cocaine, as it hits the neurons in your brain, spikes your dopamine enormously, very, very high, which is the high of cocaine. And if you do coke for a while, what happens is the neurons in your brain really get lazy and they kind of forget how to make dopamine on their own. So when you stop doing coke, your brain goes from a very high level of dopamine to a much, much lower level of dopamine, and that makes you crave the drug. It may take months for the brain cells to remember and rebalance their ability to make dopamine on their own. So what that means is you're in a vulnerable position for relapse. Alcohol, it's different. Alcohol works on a different brain chemical called GABA, G-A-B-A. It's the abbreviation for it. So I don't want to take too long with this now. We're going to dig into this later on, coming up very, very soon. But you get what the biological approach is. It's all about how the body works. Let's take those glasses off and let's put on a different pair of glasses. And let's call these glasses the psychodynamic or psychoanalytic glasses. This is the point of view in psychology I was trained in graduate school. Depending on where you go to graduate school and take all that coursework to become a psychologist, different graduate schools have different approaches that they favor. Where I went to graduate school, the psychodynamic approach was the one that I learned the most about. Now, there's a very famous name associated with this approach. The founder of psychoanalysis was a guy named Sigmund Freud, F-R-E-U-D, one of the most misunderstood people in the history of psychology. He had a lot of ideas that go back over 100 years ago. He lived in Europe toward the end of the 19th century and through the first part of the 20th century. Some of Freud's ideas about how the mind works, some of them haven't held up so well over the last century, but others have. So, it's not like he was all right or all wrong. But I want to put out just a couple of things that Freud and more modern day psychodynamic psychologists like me hold to be true. Freud he spent years of his life as a therapist and as a physician. He was a neurologist, working to understand how the human mind works. And there's a lot to psychoanalytic theory and a lot to psychodynamic theory. I'm just going to mention two pieces right now that are important. Number one, psychodynamic psychologists believe that the human mind is made up of many different layers or levels. There are parts of our mind that we're aware of. We know what we're thinking. We know what we're feeling. Right? Those are parts of the mind above the surface. That's called the conscious mind, C-O-N-S-C-I-O-U-S. So if whatever you're thinking about or whatever you're aware of right now at this moment is taking place in your conscious mind, Now, if you think about it, doesn't the conscious mind jump around all over the place, right? You're listening to my voice, you get bored, you float into a daydream. That's what's in your conscious mind. You suddenly realize your stomach feels hungry. That's what's in your conscious mind. So the conscious mind is always moving back and forth, paying attention to what's coming in through the senses or getting lost in inner world thoughts. But you see, to a psychodynamic psychologist, there's another part of the mind below the surface, which is hidden. Not hidden so much from other people, but parts of the mind that we hide from ourselves. That part of the mind underneath is called the unconscious. Sometimes it's called the subconscious, but we'll call it the unconscious. Psychodynamic psychologists believe that there is important data and important things going on in the unconscious mind. Now, why would we have an unconscious? What's it good for? To these psychologists, one of the purposes of the unconscious mind is we need a place that we can repress or automatically bury things, data, feelings, memories, experiences that are just too freaky, too upsetting to keep above the surface in the conscious mind. It's almost as if we need an underground reservoir where we can store information that is troubling or difficult to handle, or feelings that would make it very difficult to go to work or drive a car or just function in our day-to-day life. Now, this is coming out of a point of view that basically argues life is hard. Freud never said it this way because he was too smart, but I'm not, so I will. Freud basically argued that life is a bitch, that life hurts, that life is full of emotional pain and setbacks and losses and deaths and failures, and that we need a place to bury, the correct term is repression, to repress data that would be simply too overwhelmingly upsetting to keep above the surface in the conscious mind. Now, you have probably all heard of examples of this. I bet you've all heard of examples of soldiers who experience things in combat or have done things that were so traumatic and upsetting that sometimes people simply repress those memories and can't remember exactly what happened. This can happen in a traumatic car accident. It can happen as a result of physical violence. It can happen as a result of sexual trauma. It can happen as many different ways it can happen. And it's kind of like the devil's bargain. To be able to get up the next morning and go to work, to be able to still function, we need to be able to repress these traumatic events into the unconscious. But you've probably all heard the expression, gone but not forgotten. Even though I can't consciously remember some of these events, they're still in my mind, and they are still affecting the way I think and feel and act. In other words, they're still affecting my psychology. I'm not even aware of them necessarily. They're in the unconscious, but they still affect me. So if you think about, let's use PTSD as an example, post-traumatic stress disorder. Some folks with PTSD absolutely consciously remember the trauma. But it is not unusual that there are times that people have been traumatized and have post-traumatic stress disorder and don't remember or don't fully remember the specifics of the traumatic event that have created the trauma, right? But so even though if some of that upset is repressed into the unconscious, they're still going to have symptoms. They might start to have panic attacks. They might feel depressed. They might become terrified of certain places or people or situations that they were never upset about before. So the memory is repressed, but it still has a control over us. It's still affecting us. This cat you're seeing in the background, this is one of my three. This is Misha. Misha in Russian means little bear. Looks more like a panther, but anyway. Now, it's not just traumatic experiences or memories that could be repressed. We could also repress our desires. Are there things that human beings want sometimes that we're not supposed to want? We're not supposed to even think about, right? So might there be desires that we have, whether the desire to beat somebody up, to go aggressive on somebody, or sexual desires that are handled by moving them into the unconscious, right? Now, again, we're going to develop this later this semester. We'll talk more about it. I'm just kind of putting out the basic ideas here. Freud, dynamic theorists, would agree that there are ways of almost opening a door into the unconscious. Some of them are simple drug things like alcohol. Have you all known people who, when they get drunk, something comes out of their unconscious that ain't pretty? They go to an angry rage place. When they sober up, they're peaceful again. One way to think of that, Freud's way to think of that, would be that alcohol temporarily opens up a door between the conscious mind and the unconscious mind, and up it comes. When you sober up, the door comes back down again. Now, a biological psychologist would think of more, what are the chemical effects, the physiological effects of alcohol on the way the brain works? The second big idea in psychodynamic theory is that the things that happen to us when we're very young are the most important things in shaping the way we're going to be for much of the rest of our lives. That's not saying we can't change later in life, but psychodynamic psychologists believe the roots of adult behavior are back in early childhood. Freud was extreme on this. In Freud's theory, birth through 6 establishes your core personality. So Freud believed that by the time a child is only 6 years old, the deepest layers of who she is going to be for the rest of her life are already set in quick hardening cement. Other psychodynamic psychologists think there's still all kinds of other experiences in later childhood, in adolescence, in young adulthood, even in our 20s, that could significantly shape us for how we become years later in life. Now, I don't know any psychologist who would tell you that early childhood is unimportant. We know too much. There's too much research on this. The things that happen to us when we're very young, good or bad, can leave traces in the way our brains work and the way we live our lives, the way we feel about ourselves, the way we feel about the world, the way we manage our emotions, our personality, and so on. We know that if children are significantly abandoned or mistreated, especially in the early years of childhood, that there can be ghosts in their head that they will carry with them for the rest of their lives. We know that if a child is locked away for the first 12 months of his life and kept alive physically, but there's nobody for them to emotionally attach or bond to, even if they're rescued at 12 months old, there's already been some damage done. So yes, early childhood is important. Now, a lot of people don't believe this. And the reason is, one of the reasons is, we can't remember it. So if I say to one of you, what did you do a couple of weeks ago? Or what do you remember from your junior year of high school? That's later stuff. That's more recent. If I say to you, tell me the details of your life when you were 3, most of us have a few memories of being 3, but that's it. So people kind of assume, if I can't remember it, how could it be so important? To a psychodynamic psychologist, that's why it's so important. You can't remember it. It got put into you, these ideas, your views of the world, your experiences, got put into you when you were so young that they got taken in like blindly. You didn't have the mental tools to analyze and weigh them and evaluate them. So like, if I'm trying to sell you an idea right now, you are old enough now to question and analyze what Lyndon's saying. And you could accept all of it, some of it, or none of it. But if I'm dad and you're my 3-year-old son or daughter, and I'm acting in a out of control way, I'm the only reality in town. I'm all you got. And you don't have the cognitive tools to step back psychologically and to analyze my behavior. You take in the emotions of that, right? And those emotions and those thoughts and those beliefs can get put in a fairly deep way early in childhood. Okay, let me pause there. Let me now ask you to put on a third pair of glasses. This is the last one we're going to talk about in class today. And this third pair is called the sociocultural, or AKA cross-cultural approach. These psychologists have been deeply influenced by our brother-sister field of study, anthropology. Anthropology is the study of different cultures, and sociology, the study of societies. To a cross-cultural or sociocultural psychologist, the most important way to understand especially human behavior is to look at how we have been shaped psychologically by the societies and cultures in which we were raised and in which we currently reside. Now, some of you may have experienced life growing up in more than one society or culture. If you were born and raised in another part of the world and then later in life moved to the United States, have you had sometimes very different sets of experiences from where you were raised compared to where you are now? And it doesn't have to be something as dramatic as having been born and raised in Africa and then moving to New York City. It could be, let's take American society. If any of you were born and raised in an urban area and then somewhere in childhood moved out to to a very rural part of Sussex County, even though it might only be 30 miles away, were you struck by some societal differences, right? And so there are many, many cultures and societies on the planet Earth. They all have their own social and cultural norms. When we are growing up in those societies and cultures, we're shaped by those social norms. We take them in, they become part of us. They shape the way we think and feel and act. They shape our psychology, right? And so, to kind of deconstruct that, there are behaviors that would be viewed as normal in one culture and deviant or abnormal in a different culture, right? And so the way men are supposed to act. If you were born and raised in the United States, especially, in certain parts of the United States, boys are often taken certain norms about how to become men. Man up, repress your sadness and your fear, show anger, right? That's not the way it works for all men on the planet Earth. Men who are born and raised in very different sorts of cultures would not learn some of those same man up sorts of attitudes. They would learn other ways of what it means to be a man that might involve being able to show emotion more openly or show sadness and anxiety more openly. Even in the same culture or the same society, norms change over the generations. Let's think of American society. Are there behaviors that are called normal today that would have been viewed as deviant or abnormal 60, 70, 50 years ago in the United States? Sure. And I bet you can all come up with some. There's some fairly obvious one. The meaning of tattoos. In the 1920s and 30s, if you weren't in the military and you got a tattoo, it was usually because you identified in some way as being an outlaw. Now, there were exceptions, but that was a general trend. I have an old abnormal psych textbook that somebody gave me as a gift years ago. It was a psychology abnormal psych textbook from the 1930s. It was a book that was used way back in the 1930s in America to teach psychological disorders. There's a couple of pages in that book that basically say this. If you evaluate a person with a tattoo and they weren't in the military, assume that they have a psychological disorder until proven otherwise. Kid you not. It was viewed as deviant and perhaps indicative of being a psychopath. If you weren't in the military was different, to have a tattoo back in those days. Now let's compare that to 2021. Would you agree with me tattoos in America are completely mainstream, that tattoos are far more normalized today than they were 3 generations ago? And in fact, in the United States today, the largest group of people getting tattoos are young middle-class women. So tattoos went from being this sign of 3 generations ago of deviancy, which I question, but that's how it was viewed, to something that is kind of absolutely mainstream today. Another example is Americans' attitudes toward homosexuality have significantly changed over the past 2 generations. Homosexuality was listed as a psychological disorder in the United States until 1981, when it was removed from the listing of the book called the DSM. It was taken out, right? That reflects a change in the view of what's normal and what's deviant. The younger generation in America, fortunately, is far more tolerant than your grandparents or your great-grandparents on average. I'm not talking about your family, I'm talking on average, were in terms of sexual orientation. So the cross-cultural, sociocultural approach looks at these sorts of forces. Now, there's one other thing that's really important. The sociocultural approach also focuses on isms, ISMS, right? In American society, does racism exist? Yep. Does sexism exist? Yes. Does classism exist? Do people who make more money have more power and more status than people who make less money? Yes. Is there still discrimination against people of certain religions? You bet, right? The sociocultural approach also studies the psychological effects of growing up either as a dominant in society or being subordinated, having less power in society. Do people growing up on the receiving end of racism have very different life experiences, which can shape their development, their psychology differently than people growing up in white, Protestant, middle-class America? You bet. I mean, some people may argue that, but if you look at the data and you look at the research, you're arguing in a vacuum. It's very, very clear what's going on. And so growing up as the other, the different one, not in a good way, in a more subordinated way. What are the impacts of that? And then if you grow up as a dominant, how does that shape your personality? Well, there's a lot to that, right? If you've always been it, right, in a given society, if you've always been the dominant in a society, it may be very, very hard for you to recognize what life is like for people who are not dominants in society, who don't have as much social power, right? So that area really comes out of social and anthro, but psychologists kind of took that and have used it to further our understanding of psychology. Now, there's 3 other approaches that you see listed there: the behavioral, the humanistic, and the evolutionary. Those are all discussed in Module 1 in the book. I want to turn those all over to you, so you're responsible for them. And let's see, we're almost at 35 minutes. So we have finished Module 1. Let me show you where we're going this coming Wednesday, our next class, which is the 17th. And again, this is specifically for Section 04 that didn't meet on Zoom because of the video problem. I have emailed you, and I have also put into files under the course Review Sheet 2. Now, Review Sheet 2 is about how the brain works, how the nervous system works. That's what we're starting this coming Wednesday, the 17th. It is tied in your books to Module 3 and Module 4. If you're using the textbook Discovering Psychology, it is tied, and I have to confirm this, to Chapter 2. So there's 2 different books that people are using, right? If you're using Intro to Psych 10th edition, it's Module 3 and 4. If you're using Discovering Psych, it's Chapter 2, but I need to confirm that, and I will do that. Okay, remember that the other thing is, some of you have sent me topic proposals for your paper, and I've gotten them back to you, and I will continue to do that. But I need something from each of you by Friday, February 19th, which is 1 week from this Friday. 1 week. I'm recording this Thursday. It's 1 week from tomorrow. So, send me a topic proposal via Canvas email. I'll give you feedback on your ideas, help you get started with the next step. If you're completely adrift in the water and have no idea, don't wait until late next week to reach out to me via email. Let me know soon so we can play around with it a little bit. You can always reach me through Canvas email. So we're at 35 minutes, so I'm about to shut this down. So let me hear from you if you got any comments or questions, and take good care. I'll see you next Wednesday. Bye-bye.